Welcome back to this special edition of BottomLine Africa. Now, South Africa's ruling ANC met to decide the future of embattled President Jacob Zuma. The head of the opposition, Mmusi Maimane, criticized ANC leader Cyril Ramaphosa, saying he is, quote-unquote, willing to negotiate on an easy exit for the president. Maimane is calling for a vote in parliament to assure Zuma's departure. Separately, Julius Malema, leader of the radical opposition, Economic Freedom Fighters Party, well known as the EFF, says the ANC only wants Zuma to go because it is time for Cyril's group to eat, accusing them of just swooping from one corrupt fellow to another corrupt fellow. Let's listen into what they had to say.
They want Zuma to go because it's the time for Cyril's group to eat. And they call it a transition. Transition from what? It can't be a transition. It's not a transition. That is an abuse of concepts. It's a factions changing, swapping seats. Instead of transition, we must call it swapping. It's not a transition, it's a swapping. From one corrupt fellow to another corrupt fellow.
We need to be able to put in place leadership that will address economic challenges, the fundamentals about how we deal with poverty. And therefore, in the light of their opposition parties are unanimous in their call that we must have a special sitting of parliament to vote on the leadership of President Jacob Zuma, and that we request with urgency that we elect a new president. The election of the new president will then be contested through multiple candidates, and we can ensure that we focus South Africa on achieving that dream. We need to ensure that, again, the call from our point of view must always be immediately call parliament, immediately vote, elect a new president, and we call upon all South Africans. Let them march, take to the streets, and we want to ensure that Jacob Zuma is removed so that we can get a new beginning for South Africa and we can focus on the contestation of ideas going forward. Cyril Ramaphosa is a loyalist of the ANC. He has been there for the last 5 years. I wish him well, but I'm very aware of the fact that he will come on and has shown that Zuma still holds all the power and that in fact he's still willing to negotiate on an easy exit for the president and willing to negotiate on the fact that we must give amnesty to Jacob Zuma is an indicator of the fact that there is still an appetite within the ANC to protect corruption. Fact of the matter is that South Africans are asking for justice.
Well, those are some of the opposition members clearly criticizing the ANC party. Now, Dewa, if you're still with me, let me begin this second part with you. And if you already indicated that ANC is seeking fresh leadership, that is why they want Jacob Zuma to resign. How fresh is Cyril Ramaphosa? Because this is a man who has served as a deputy president for a long time. And of course, he has been a member of the ANC for a very long time as well.
Oh yes, he has been from the early days of Nelson Mandela. Ramaphosa was there. But what is clear is that Ramaphosa represents that kind of legacy that was around Mandela and might revive that. In terms of the economy, he is respected, but the challenge is that Zuma is not just one individual. Zuma still has powerful supporters within the ANC, and also he comes from a powerful group of the Zulu nation, and therefore this is why there is need, even with clear evidence of corruption and fraud, for a very careful approach, because South Africa is prone to extreme political violence, and there could be an eruption of that if the matter is not handled properly. This is why you would find that even as things are this clear, Ramaphosa and his team are giving Zuma space and time and are negotiating and urging him to voluntarily step aside, because to push him and to force him to jump might result in utter chaos.
Yes, well said, Dewa. Now, Mark, let me pose this question. Of course, we've seen Malema and of course, Maimane, or is it Maimane, criticizing the ANC party. It seems things are not that all rosy within the African National Congress Party.
The ANC is an interesting party, and how it's structured over the last 20 or so years of its history is quite compelling. First and foremost, the rivalry between Mbeki and Zuma had undertones of rivalry between the Zulu nation and the Xhosa nation, as you would have it. And that particular rivalry led to the rise of Jacob Zuma, despite the fact that South Africans knew that his education background and his affinity to corruption was quite a matter that was in the public domain. But they chose to overlook that in order to advance what was considered the rights of the Zulu people, as my good friend has alluded to before. Now, the question is, Cyril Ramaphosa being a vendor, would he then be able to garner the support of the Xhosas and the Zulus for that matter? But still, it goes even deeper by the question because the question you have to ask yourself, Cyril Ramaphosa was identified by Nelson Mandela as a possible candidate to take over from him. Has he changed? Is he as corrupt as Zuma? That's the question. But also, let's remember that the weakness of one particular party and its silence is very interesting. There's a party that is very strong in Durban called the Inkatha Freedom Party, and this was considered the party of the Zulu nation. What is going to happen to that? And then let's not forget that Julius Malema, popularly known as Juju Malema, is a product of Jacob Zuma. He was Jacob Zuma's hatchet man in 2007, and he bears a great grudge against the ANC for having booted him out for, very interestingly, corruption. He is known as the biggest entrepreneur in South Africa. So the reality of the matter is, are we seeing a morphing of corruption, or are we seeing a turning of the tables to bring back order into South Africa?
Yes, Mark, of course, those are some of the concerns that were earlier raised by both Malema and the other opposition leader. Now, Bernard, let's talk about youth leadership. Of course, this is something that, Africans have been talking about for a very, very long time. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure there's a youth wing within ANC, but we're not seeing any youthful leader, especially among the key personalities within the ANC party. What does that say about youth leadership in South Africa?
That's the challenge that South Africa, ANC as a political party, has now. Because previously, when Julius Malema was holding the position, we could see that the Youth League was very vibrant. But I think ANC, because having learned that a very strong youth league, or rather a very vibrant youth league, may dent the political party, they decided this time, I think, to front a very kind of weak candidate to handle the youth league. So that is the challenge that they currently have. However,
yes.
However, we can see in terms of, if you leave out the youth league, in terms of civil disobedience, we can see the youths have poured out in the streets in terms of big numbers to rally that Zuma must go. And therefore, we cannot wash them away, because we've seen the youth taking their civil responsibility quite seriously by going to the streets and demanding that Zuma has to leave. And therefore, we cannot wash away them, despite the fact that they have a weak leader in terms of within the ANC as a political party.
Of course, we've seen numerous protests in South Africa taking place, especially among the youth. And we have a soundbite here which says a lot about the formal education of Jacob Zuma. Let's listen to that first, and then I'll proceed on to Deva.
We announced that our membership figures stood at 700, listen properly, 769,820 and 70 members, down from 100.2 million in 2012.
Seems Jacob Zuma there has issues with numbers. Now, Dewa, you come from a country that has the biggest economy in Africa, of course. It has the biggest stock exchange, but unemployment rate is one of the highest in the world. There are cases of insecurity. I mean, does this blame squarely have to stay with Zuma?
Yes, but also beyond Zuma, because look, South Africa has the largest economy in Africa, but also is a recipient of huge numbers of immigrants from across the African continent, and is coming from a history of apartheid and massive inequalities, which the successive administrations have been battling to deal with. But chief among the contributory factors has been corruption and lack of management skills at the highest level. And this is something that perhaps Ramaphosa might be able to address in the sense of bringing the South African economy to perform, because business supports and is very supportive of Ramaphosa. But the risk of violence is very high and needs to be addressed decisively in a manner that does not portray Zuma as a victim, but really as someone who has dug his own grave, so to speak. Because if he is portrayed as a victim, then that could have massive repercussions.
Yes. Now, Mark, apparently, this is a leader who is very controversial. Can you perhaps talk us through about his, educational background? Because of those who are saying he doesn't have formal education. And perhaps how did he even manage to get at the helm of, the biggest economy in Africa? And what does that say about ANC as a political party?
First and foremost, Jacob Zuma has no educational background. I think he's fluent in Zulu traditional dance. That's what the only thing probably I've seen him do proficiently. And it's a lie when we say that a country that accommodates foreigners actually suffers. The truth of the matter is Jacob Zuma has systematically destroyed the South African economy. I happened to have lived in South Africa for a year and a half between 2003 and 2004, and I've visited it quite regularly since then. And every time things have gotten worse, roads are worse. They have an energy sector that now is not energy sufficient. They have power rationing. Can you imagine that in a country which was left to him functioning? Today it's on its knees. So this is testimony indeed that you cannot trust a sophisticated economy such as South Africa to an uneducated and very selfish man as Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma had the effrontery to actually kick out one of the elite anti-corruption teams called the Scorpion team, and kicked them out for the simple reason that they were investigating him. This is a man who, despite having no background in education, has actually shown himself as a ranking fool as far as leadership is concerned. And not only that, he's probably one of the most corrupt people in a developed country we've seen in a very long time.
Yeah, and speaking about corruption, Bernard, this is a man who was apparently kicked out by Thabo Mbeki some time back because of corruption. And then Thabo Mbeki ended up losing his own seat because of Zuma. And we're seeing Zuma now being kicked out by ANC because of corruption again. Does this vindicate, does this mean Thabo Mbeki was right from the initial stage?
Actually, Thabo Mbeki fate was determined because of maladministration. He abused his power. However, we can see that Zuma right now is highly promoting what we can call, in terms of political terms, state capture, whereby he's dealing with the business elite, and therefore him is there to generate money. And that explains why, despite his ignorance, despite his lack of education, you can see the guy is very good at mobilizing the party. In terms of mobilization, he enjoys the massive support because he's using his resources to enjoy and to revamp his position within the political party. Unlike Mbeki, Mbeki was a visionary leader. Mbeki was not interested in terms of looting resources, and therefore being an elite, and therefore also being, more of a decent guy, he decided to just quit. Unlike Zuma, who we can see that because of his interest within the political party, he realizes that the party is a very good vehicle for him to make so much resources. So we can see that he's still holding on to power. However, I don't see him surviving because the top organ of the party has already passed the resolution, and therefore he just has to leave.
Yes. Now, let me pose this final question to all of you, and let me begin with Dewa in South Africa. Now, Dewa, there are many people who are asking this, what or when do we expect Zuma to resign, and perhaps what are some of the options out there for him? And perhaps can you tell us who this Cyril Ramaphosa is all about? Is he someone who's going to perhaps change South Africa as a nation?
Oh, yes, we expect that resignation from Zuma should happen in the next 24 hours or so, unless if he chooses to fight, in which case then we are looking at an impeachment in Parliament. And because the ANC is the majority and the opposition are already aligned to get rid of Zuma, it is really a fait accompli. There is no debate about Zuma going when it goes to Parliament. Ramaphosa is viewed largely as a loyalist who might take the ANC and government back to the Nelson Mandela legacy, because he was at one point Mandela's blue-eyed boy, as it were. Ramaphosa was also there negotiating the transition from apartheid to independence. So he is someone who is very much respected, and also in business, and therefore he would give South Africa the kind of stability that it requires. It's unclear whether he will be able to decisively deal with corruption, but certainly his administration might be way better than Zuma's, because Zuma was completely focused on issues of patronage and enrichment of himself and his allies. So if he stays around any longer, then it means that the South African economy will go down. But there is hope, some hope with Ramaphosa.
Well said, Dewa. Mark, as you make your final comment, do you believe Cyril Ramaphosa might turn around South Africa? And perhaps, as you make that final comment, do you think other political parties in the continent, Kenya included, should have the same power as ANC?
First and foremost, the political parties, including those in Kenya, actually have this power. That is why in countries like Kenya, political parties die and rise every 5 years, because politicians are afraid of strong political parties. And it is indeed my hope that parties such as Jubilee, which have shown the capacity to actually want to stay together, and I hope more parties will do that in this country, to stay together so that we are able to entrench inter-party democracy, because democracy does not start at the ballot. It actually starts when we select our representatives in political parties. Cyril Ramaphosa, to put him into perspective, is someone who's considered to have brought a lot of change and to carry the mind of one Nelson Mandela. He has the education, he has the background, and he has the history of being able to transform South Africa. He was indeed involved in the transition between apartheid and free South Africa. He was also involved during Mbeki's time, where the GDP of South Africa grew quite a bit. But one of the things that he has to deal with, you remember the fight against foreigners, famously known in South Africa as Amakwerekwere. What he needs to fight most in South Africa is the belief that these foreigners bring poverty to South Africa. The poverty being faced in South Africa is caused by the capture of the state by private interest to create corruption, as has been seen to be rife in the rest of Africa. He needs to stem that, and he needs to get the South African people to focus on who the real Amakwerekwere are. These are people within the ANC who are only interested in personal gain, especially after the demise of Nelson Mandela, because over his ghost, they seem to be plundering the Mandela dream.
Well said, Mark. Bernard, as you make a final comment, should political parties, the rest of the continent, have similar powers to recall a sitting head of state? Do you think that is going to improve governance in the continent?
My take is political parties all over Africa have that ability. The challenge is that they are driven by sycophancy as opposed to patriotism. And therefore, if political parties, and this challenge should be posed to members of political parties, because just like constitutions that under Article 1 states that we, the people are sovereign, that should apply to political parties. And therefore, if we leave out even the Jujua part of it, even if it is not articulated in their statutes, then therefore the citizens or members of that political party should use a de facto means whereby the people have the right and the people have the power to recall inept leaders.
Thank you very much, Bernard Otieno, for your input. Bernard is from the Africa Peer Review Mechanism. Earlier, I spoke to Dewa Maringa, all the way from South Africa. He's from the Human Rights Watch, as well as Mark Bichachi, who's a political communication strategist. Many thanks, gentlemen, for your input. And before we wrap up the show tonight, of course, I'm going to go through some of your feedback on Twitter, but for now, it's about time we look at the images of the day. And over 30 African designers unveiled their latest winter collections at the South African's Menswear Week in Cape Town over the weekend. Now, the event attracts established and upcoming designers from parts of the continent twice a year to showcase their work at the only fashion event in Africa dedicated to promoting menswear. Now, Johannesburg-based designer Nao Serato, who's known for his fearless unisex creations that target young people, was one of the highlights. Serato's collections incorporated mesh, synthetic materials, and other fabrics to bring out his unconventional pieces done in bold colors. Anthe Kosi Mfungula's work was a crowd favorite. The upcoming South African designer showcased pieces from his brand, Lemfuchs, which he says takes cues from military uniforms.
With my designing, I draw inspiration from military. So it's always going to be military because I love structure. And this year's theme was military transition. It was formed from American War of Independence. And the theme had 3 different compartments. It was separated into liberty, equality, and freedom. And all those compartments were inspired by the house of the Arts of Delacroix, the Wall of Berlin, and St. Paul's Cathedral.
I draw my inspiration from Africa and with an element of the West as well. But for this collection, I was inspired by the 70s. So I was basically designing for a 70s man going to a festival.
We really need to pay attention to young African fashion designers in terms of providing. In fact, a lot of the countries in Europe and in the US are taking a lot of ideas from African designers. And I think that the more we can create platforms for them to express their creativity, the better for them to create economic opportunities in the industry.
Well, this is what we did ask you in our Twitter poll tonight. We did ask you, should political parties in Africa be empowered to recall non-performing leaders? 88% of you said yes, and only 12% of you said no. At Nikarodi says, yes, lack of these powers made most of these leaders to slip on the job and serve their interest only. At Gatet Tua Duarte says, no politicians will petition Africa if allowed so. Lucky Sean says, absolutely, this should be effected faster than lightning. And Janga Gasson says, yes, because these leaders will have already ceased to represent the interest of the people. One final one. At Dan Don 5 says, the political parties form the paradigm of ideologies that the leader represents. The parties reserve the powers to enforce the mandate. Many thanks for your input. Of course, you've been watching BottomLine Africa right on KTN News. Remember, this program is aired every Monday to Thursday from 10 to 11 p.m. Until tomorrow, same place, same time. Bye-bye, and enjoy the rest of the evening.